All right. I don't know if you're going to be happy or sad about this, but we're not going to be doing any R coding today. Happy, sad? Kind of sad. Oh, well, that's good. Good. Because previous semesters, people were like, yay, no R today. Um, Today, what we're going to do is we're going to start um, working through your building up your understanding of the underlying theoretical basis for doing statistical analysis. And it's this information that, in my opinion, is crucial for you to be able to understand why statistics work. And if you understand why statistics work at a theoretical basis, there literally is no statistical analysis that at some point in the future you can't figure out. It may take a little bit of work, it may take certainly learning some new code and things like this, but at the heart of it, all statistics is based on the set of principles that I'm going to talk to you about over the course of the next couple of days. And so one of my colleagues who also teaches statistics at William Hill College has asked me, how do you squeeze so many different things into one semester of statistics? And I told my colleague the thing that I do at the beginning is I work on these fundamentals. And if you have those fundamentals down, it then becomes very easy to explain all of the statistics because you're always falling back on these base principles. Are there any of you who are on the baseball team? What are the fundamentals of baseball? Fielding, hitting, pitching. That's baseball. That's baseball in three fundamental things. If you do those things really well over and over and over again as a team, you're going to win games. And so statistics is kind of like baseball. We fall back repeatedly on a couple of fundamental ideas. Those fundamental ideas apply to a t-test. They apply to an ANOVA. They apply to linear regression. They apply to multivariate statistics. But it's the same underlying principles. So let's get started. In theory, maybe my clicker is out of power. Okay. So what today we're going to be talking about is primarily basic statistical principles. Later on, we're going to get to some output that comes from an R script. That R markdown file is actually on the Moodle site in today's dates folder. Also, this PowerPoint is also in there. This PowerPoint is a combined PowerPoint between a postdoc at KU and myself. She needed to do a basic statistics primer for some molecular biologists there. She came to me and asked for some ideas on how to organize this. She put together a thing. I had some stuff that I had used in this class before. After she got her stuff put together, I'm like, oh, that's some pretty good stuff. So I kind of merged the two together. So this is kind of a collaborative presentation. So we're going to talk about basic statistical principles, describing data, testing hypotheses, and we'll also talk some about data management and organization. But most of the next 2 days is going to be just about the basic principles. So when we think about data are variable. And a lot of times people get upset when you talk about data being variable, but data are just naturally variable. Everybody stand up for a minute. Okay. Are we all the same height? No. If we were measuring height for this class, the data would be variable. And the data would be variable for good reason. How tall are you? 6'7". How tall are your parents? 6'5" and 5'6". You're 6'7" because you inherited all of the dominant versions of the genes for height that your parents had to give you. Not quite all of them, but most of them, the majority of them. As a result, you're much taller, partly because your parents, one of them was on the tall side, one of them was average. Your mom's 5'6"? Yeah. There's a sexual dimorphism in height in humans. So your height is determined to a certain degree by the heights of your parents. That variation is genetically based. That variation is real. And so we should expect height to be variable. And you look around the room and height is variable, but this is a real deterministic sort of variability. And one of the things that we as statisticians have to do is we have to contend with that variability. Sit down. So variability isn't a bad thing. It's just something that we have to think about and something that we have to have constantly in the back of our mind. From the standpoint of being a biologist, I think about variability in terms of the sources of variability from a biological perspective. So I think about genetic sources of variability, environmental sources of variability, variability due to sex, sexual dimorphism in human height, for example, and then other aspects of the variability of things. If you're a business person, you might be looking at the manufacturing capacity of 3 different plants owned in 3 different parts of the country in terms of determining which of those plants might be most efficient at producing whatever product it is that your company produces. Well, there's going to be day-to-day variability because of supply chain issues, because somebody got sick, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all deterministic kinds of causes of variability. And knowing about that variability is necessary, but variability is something that we have to contend with. There are sources of variation due to, once again, experiments. If you're a biologist, if you're in business, variation from plant to plant, that might be important variation. Variation from year to year or season to season. So, for example, on Wednesday, did any of you guys have class in Marston Hall? Marston Hall, they lost heating, and so all of the classes that were in Marston had to be moved either online or to another part of the campus. There's variation that you can't control, but once again, occurs because of situations where you just don't have any control over that kind of variability. That's what usually happens in experiments if you're a biologist, or this natural variation from store to store, plant to plant, or something like that if you're in business. And then there's sampling error and measurement error. And generally, we have to account for all of these things, but generally we're interested in these systematic forms of variation. Systematic forms of variation that are informative for the kinds of questions that we have. If you work for M&M's and you are, well, who owns M&M's? Mars. That's the company I was thinking of. You guys just knew that right off the top of your heads. If you're looking at M&M sales and you want to know whether you have more sales in the South versus the Midwest versus the Northeast versus the West Coast, you're actually interested in sales numbers from these different regions to determine, who's buying your product. Within each of those regions, you might have sales that are happening at employee-owned companies like Hy-Vee versus chain companies with stockholders like Price Chopper, and you might be interested in knowing whether or not certain types of stores differ in terms of their sales of your product. Those are all systematic sources of variation that might be obscured by things like sampling error and measurement error. So we want to know about some forms of variation, and we want to control other kinds of variation, have some way of accounting for those things. So the way we do this is ultimately by sampling. So you have a population, let's just take the M&M's store thing again. You could look at all of the grocery stores throughout the entire country, and you could look at sales of M&M's in all of the grocery stores everywhere. But that would take a huge amount of money because there are a lot of grocery stores. There are 9 grocery stores just here within 5 miles of the campus of William Jewell College. And so rather than actually monitoring every one of those grocery stores throughout the entire nation, what you might do is you might take a representative sample of sales numbers at a representative number of stores in the Northeast, the South, the Midwest, the West. And then you would use that sampling of stores to tell you something about what the entire population of sales numbers are. But because you're only taking a sample of that population, the sales numbers that you get from that sample are going to be slightly different or radically different depending on the relationship of your sample to your population. They're going to be different from what you would find if you looked at the entire population. Similar example, if we wanted to look at the relationship between high school GPA and college success, whether or not you graduate and what your GPA is in college, we could actually take all the college students in the United States, look at their GPAs, and look at their success in college, and we can look at that relationship and see if success in high school is a good predictor or not of success in college. But that would require huge amounts of money because there are tons of college students in the United States. What we might do instead is we might go to, 40 campuses. 10 of those are R1 institutions, 10 of those are regional state schools, 10 of those are private liberal arts colleges, 10 of those are public liberal arts colleges. And in each of those colleges and universities, we might select 50 students each, get their GPA scores from high school, get their GPA scores from college, and then see if those two things are related to one another. We're sampling this really big population to get some insight about that big population without spending a ton of money and a ton of time to try and get that answer. As a result, that answer is an estimate of what that true population answer is. So the question is, how are we able to extrapolate from a sample to a population? And that's what theoretical statistics tells us we can do. So, samples vary in quality. A good sample is random. We select the individuals at random. It's representative of the thing that we're wanting to describe. And the choice of one individual within that sample is independent of the choice of another individual in that sample. So, do any of you guys have siblings that go to William Jewell College? No, sometimes we get that, sometimes we don't. For example, if we were taking a sample from William Jewell College to look at the success of college students, we wouldn't want to inadvertently sample a brother and sister or two brothers or something like that, because at that point, those two data points might be linked by something other than high school grades and college success. There may be something going on in that family that affects the success of both of those individuals that is totally independent of the thing that you're actually interested in measuring. So the idea of sampling theory, the idea that there are characteristics of a sample that allow you to rely on those estimates from the sample to tell you something about the population, adhering to those characteristics is important. Random samples, representative samples, independent samples. These are all things that you see to before you ever go out and gather data. You gather data in a way that you ensure that your samples meet these types of criteria. At some point, we have to talk about these ideas that, unfortunately, the internet is terrible at teaching you. There's so many things that the internet is terrible teaching you that I just can't even get started on it, but this is one of those things. This is a figure that people typically would pull off of the internet and use to describe precision, accuracy, repeatability, and bias. In this case, it's only dealing with accuracy and precision. And it's completely, it's not completely and totally wrong, but it's largely incorrect. Here you have darts being shot at a target, and figure A here says it's low accuracy and low precision. In reality, it's as precise as the needle is at the tip of the dart. It's not accurate because it's not hitting the bullseye, the intended target. So you can think about data that you gather for a sample as trying to tell you something about the population. And in many cases, what you want to know about is the population mean, for example. So one question you could ask of your sample is, how close does your sample get to actually estimating the population mean? Well, if this is 3 samples, none of these samples are estimating the population mean very well, which means that it is low accuracy. We're not really sure what the precision is. Then this says that this is low accuracy but high precision. And the reason that they're saying it's high precision is because all those data points, all those darts, are clustered together in one little spot. But that's not what precision is. Precision is about how finely you break up the measurement scale that you're using to measure something. This is actually repeatability. You suck at finding the bullseye, but every time you put a dart into the target, it's at the same spot. You need to move your aim over a little bit, adjust the sight on your bow and arrow, or adjust your sight as you're throwing darts, because this is actually low accuracy, high repeatability, but a high level of bias. Your estimate is systematically off the mark in some way. This is higher accuracy because you're closer to the bullseye, but once again, it says it's low precision, but precision isn't listed here anywhere. It's not illustrated here anywhere because all these darts are the same size. So if you have a meter stick and you're measuring height of individuals, if you look at a meter stick is divided up into millimeters. The meter stick is divided up into a bunch of little hash marks, and there are 1,000 of them. There are 1,000 divisions in a meter stick, indicating that each division is 1 millimeter. If you take a tape measure that a person uses out in the field to measure plots and things like this, you oftentimes find that these are divided up into 100 divisions, which means that these are marked off at 1 decimeter. This is more precise than this because this is divided up more finely. You can detect small differences in the length of things because you have a measuring instrument that allows you to detect those tiny differences. Here, you can only detect differences at the level of a decimeter. Here, you can detect length at the level of a millimeter. That's the equivalent of having bigger or smaller sized darts. This says high accuracy, high precision, but as I've already said, this is just total bull. So I created my own graphic. Think of the target as a target being shot at with a gun. This should be good in America because Americans love guns. You guys know the difference between a .44 caliber and a .22? What's the difference? Yeah. 44 has a big old slug. It's going to put a gigantic hole in you. .22 is a little tiny slug. You guys go hunting? Oh my gosh. When I was a kid, I would go hunting with my dad. My dad was an expert marksman. He was basically a sniper in the military in the Korean War. And it was very important to him that I grow up and be able to shoot well. And so we would go deer hunting, and I had a Winchester. I still have a Winchester Model 94 30-30. That was my deer hunting rifle. I had my grandfather's .22 caliber long rifle, bolt action, 14 bullet tube on the bottom of it that served as the magazine, fed each little individual bullet into there, and then you put a plunger down in it, kept it tensioned. And I had a .410, which was my bird gun. For most people, a .410 shotgun would be a bird and squirrel gun. With birds, you need a shotgun because the bird's flying around, and you want something that has a bigger spread so you can hit the bird because the bird is in flight. Most people who go squirrel hunting also go squirrel hunting with something like a 410 because they want to be able to hit this fast-moving squirrel, but they don't want too much shot in the squirrel when they go to eat the squirrel. My dad wouldn't let me shoot squirrels with a shotgun. It was way less precise than he wanted me to be with a gun. He forced me to shoot squirrels with a 22. With a 22, though, if you hit the squirrel in the body, it tears up the squirrel quite a lot. And so my dad forced me to shoot squirrels, and I pretty much had to do headshots all the time if you expect to get any decent meat out of the squirrel. 22 is a much more precise gun than a 410 shotgun or the deer rifle. If you shoot a squirrel with a deer rifle, you're not eating anything because it's just exploded and that's it. So precision is about the caliber of the bullet that you're using to hit the target. So this analogy actually works for accuracy, precision, repeatability, and bias. This person is shooting with a not very precise gun. You hit this target anywhere with this large caliber shot, it's going to blow a big hole in the target will be dead. It's not precise because of that. It's not accurate because it's not hitting the bullseye. It's not repeatable because the shots are not all clustered in one spot, but it's also not biased because they all kind of are surrounding the bullseye. This is a situation that is not accurate. It has the same level of lack of accuracy as before. It's not accurate. It's not repeatable. It's the same level of lack of repeatability. It's also not biased. It is more precise because the bullet holes are smaller. 44 versus a 38. Once again, same pattern. Not accurate, not repeatable, not biased. Even more precise because now you're shooting at the target with a 22. More precise than this one because you're shooting with a 38 rather than a 44. More repeatable because they're all clustered. Still not accurate, but it's biased. All of the things are offset in one particular direction, meaning that there's a systematic bias in where the target is being hit. This is highly precise because you're hitting, not with a 22, probably with a pellet gun. Very small projectile that you're trying to hit the bullseye with. It's precise, it's highly accurate, they're all in the bullseye. It's highly repeatable because it's a nice tight cluster, and it's not biased because it's actually hitting the target that you're aiming at. You want your samples to be accurate. First and foremost, it should be estimating accurately the thing that you're trying to estimate. Should be repeatable so that if you do the sampling repeatably, you get the same answer over and over again. It should not be biased, which once again goes to, are you getting the correct answer? And precision is largely dependent upon how precise you need to be. For some questions, you might need to be very, very precise. For other questions, you don't have to be very precise. You could actually get a workable answer with less time and less money if you sacrifice a little bit of precision. So you mainly want to be accurate, repeatable, and unbiased. Precision is really dependent upon the kind of question you're asking. But this is a better way of thinking about it than this is. This is all over the internet, and it pains me. Yeah.
So, like, when something's biased, it's your data is showing you different answers than expected.
It's showing you different answers than what the truth is.
Okay.
So in theory, if you could phone up God and say, okay, I want to know the average GPA of all students in the United States from high school, You could either sample all those individuals, spend a ton of money and a ton of time sampling the entire population, at which point you know what the answer is. Just add all those up and divide by the number of students in high school, and you have the answer. That is the answer, assuming that you haven't made any mistakes in recording the data. But that's a lot of work. The other thing you do is call up God, who potentially is all-knowing, omniscient, and say, hey, God, what's the average GPA of all high school students? And he would just tell you because he's God and he can do stuff like that. But since we don't have a ton of time and money, and we're also not God, we have to sample. And when we sample, our hope is that that sample is representative enough, etc., that it gives us the correct answer, or close enough to the correct answer, to treat it as if it was the population mean, when we're not actually accessing the entire population.
Right.
Yeah?
I'm just curious, what makes the furthest right example there not biased, but the second to right one not biased?
This one is biased because it's not accurate, but it's not accurate in a particular way.
Okay.
This is not accurate because you just suck at shooting targets. You're just not accurate. This is basically, oh, well, a classic example. We have I should have brought a meter stick to school today. We have meter sticks in the biology department that we send students out into the field to measure things with. It's a wooden meter stick. It's divided up into 1,000 units, so you can measure things down to a millimeter. But when we give these things to students, I'm sorry, Clara and Elizabeth, I don't mean this to reflect negatively on either of you. When we put a meter stick into the hand of a biology student and send them to the field, any guesses as to what they do with that meter stick?
Break it.
They don't break it exactly. They use it as a walking stick. And so as they're walking along, out on the trail, going to their field site, they're wearing away one end of the meter stick. So if the meter stick is no longer a meter stick, it's a little less than a meter stick. And so when they go then to measure something, they measure it, and it's always a couple of millimeters shy of what the actual length of that thing that they're measuring is, because they use the meter stick as a walking stick, which it's not. It's a meter stick. So that's a situation where those measurements are consistently biased to be a little shorter than the actual length that is being measured, because the measurement device has bias built into it. So they're really repeatable. They have a high level of precision, et cetera, et cetera. They're just a little bit off the mark, but they're a little bit off the mark in a particular direction always, as opposed to just being not very repeatable and inaccurate. Does that make sense? Okay. Sorry, biology majors everywhere, but it's true. Biology majors use meter sticks as walking sticks, and we tell them not to, but they still do anyway. Okay, that's true. It's my failing. Okay, so our samples need to be representative, they need to be random, they need to be independent. We need to maximize precision, repeatability, and accuracy, and we need to minimize bias. Those are the characteristics of what a good sample would look like. Questions? All right. So one of the questions people always ask is, how do you know when you've gathered enough data? There are some short and fast rules. Sample size of 30 is a pretty good measure of the size of the sample. But there are other ways to do this. Part of what influences how big a sample you need is the shape of the distribution in the population. And so if we were to go out into the population and measure something like grade point average, we might find that that distribution has a nice normal bell-shaped sort of curve. In which case, when we sample that population, we actually need fewer samples than if the sample were biased as a result of grade inflation, where if this is GPA of 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. I didn't really space those out very well. So this is a left skewed population, whereas this is centered such that the mean and the median and the mode are all the same value. In this case, the mode is here, the median is here, and the average, the mean, is going to be over here somewhere, because these low values pull the mean over towards the left-hand side. That's what it means to be left-hand skewed. And so it takes more sampling from this population to, for example, get a good estimate of the mean than it does from this population, because the mean is centered in this population as opposed to the mean is skewed in this population. So figuring out how much you need to sample partly depends on what kind of population you're trying to estimate a parameter for. So this is a normal distribution. One of the nice things about the normal distribution is it has really predictable properties. The normal distribution it's symmetrical around the mean, it has a single mode, and the mean and the median and the mode are all the same number. They're all the same value. One of the things that we know about the normal distribution is we know how much of the area underneath the curve exists at 1, 2, 3, and 4 standard deviations away from the mean. This is something called the empirical rule. And this is one of the first big important things that you need to remember. The empirical rule is basically just a set of statements about what happens with a normal curve. So empirical rule basically describes the area under the curve for a normal distribution and if you start at the mean and go out 1 standard deviation to either side of the mean, at 1 standard deviation, that area includes 68% of the observations in that population. If you go out 1.96, almost 2 standard deviations, this includes 95% of the population. If you go out to 3 standard deviations, you pick up a little more, but you have to go out another whole standard deviation on either side to pick up that extra 4.7%. And if you go out to 4 standard deviations, it's essentially 99% of the population. So this is what the empirical rule tells you. It tells you what proportion of the total population lies under the normal curve at different deviations from the mean. We use this in statistics because we want to know, for example, if you have a sample drawn from this population and a sample drawn from another population, what are the chances that those two populations are the same that you drew those two samples from versus whether they're different? And as it turns out, through something that I view as akin to magic, we see normal distributions of data very often in statistics when we take averages. So there's another concept that we will be dealing with for the rest of today and into Monday called the central limit theorem. Have any of you guys ever heard of the central limit theorem before? Yeah, what is it? Clara, I know you've heard of it before because we went through it last semester. Clara gets picked on because I just had her in class last semester. Do you remember? Anybody else? You shook your head. Yeah, you've heard of it.
I've heard of it, but I forget what it is.
Anybody remember what it says exactly? Okay. What the central limit theorem says is, if you have a population, you draw from that population a sample, you calculate the sample mean, and you save that sample mean. Do that again. Take a sample, calculate the sample mean, save that sample mean, go back to the population, do it again, 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 do it again. Do this 1,000 times. When you then plot the distribution of those sample means, guess what the shape of that distribution of sample means will be? It'll be a normal distribution. But in addition to that being a normal distribution of sample means, it will be a normal distribution of sample means regardless of the shape of the distribution of the original population. If you take samples from a normal population, it's really easy to see why the distribution of sample means from a normal population would be normally distributed. However, if you take a bunch of samples from a population, record the sample mean, do that over and over again, and then make a distribution of that distribution of sample means, it will be a normally distributed distribution regardless of whether the original population is shaped like this, it could be 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 shaped like that. It doesn't matter. Take a sample out of this, calculate the sample mean, store it, throw those observations back in, take another sample, calculate sample mean, store it, throw those observations back in, take another sample, another sample, another sample, another sample. The distribution that you get out at the end of the sample means is normally distributed. It is like magic. It isn't magic, it's math, but math of this level is, in my mind, akin to magic. Why is it important that the distribution of sample means be normal? Yeah.
Because we know the empirical rule, we know which the math the data will be within what range of the mean.
Okay.
So if we know that the means are normally distributed, we can use like the kind of like intervals of confidence that would allow us to find out where the most likely the actual mean of the data is.
That is exactly what we do. So if you know that the distribution of sample means is going to be normal, we can then apply the empirical rule to that distribution of sample means. So now, this is not a distribution of observations, this is a distribution of sample means. And if we take a sample from that distribution of, if we go to a population and take a sample, if it's from the population that generated this distribution of sample means, that mean should be somewhere within this range of values. If we take a sample and calculate its sample mean, and it falls outside of that range, chances are we drew it from a different population, not the population that generated this distribution of sample means. That's the basis of statistical inference. In order to do statistics, you need the central limit theorem to be true so that you can then use the empirical rule to make decisions. In order to do statistics, in order to make decisions about data, you need the central limit theorem to be true so that you can then apply the empirical rule to that distribution of sample means in order to make a decision about that sample mean. You can't apply the empirical rule unless the central limit theorem gives you a normal curve, a normal distribution. That is statistics in a nutshell. If you can rely on the central limit theorem, then you can use the empirical rule to make decisions. If the central limit theorem doesn't work, then the empirical rule doesn't really help you. So the question is, does the central limit theorem actually work? Empirical rule, I've been through all this, but there are slides. But this is where we get the p-value of 0.05. So when we make decisions, we oftentimes test things. We build 95% confidence intervals, and we test statistics at the 0.05 alpha level, which I'm saying all these things that they don't mean anything to you. But that 95% is something that comes from this empirical rule. Because if this is a distribution of sample means, just like I said before, I sample a mean and it fits within this range, we can say that that sample mean was taken from the same population that this distribution of sample means came from. If I sample a sample and get a sample mean and it lies outside of that range, then obviously it came from another distribution of sample means that came from a different population than the population that generated this distribution of sample means. So that's why we use this value of 0.05. I'll talk to you about alpha levels and what that means later, but this is kind of the basis of it. It all goes back to the empirical rule. So, well, I guess later is now, isn't it? So, let's see, how do I want to do this? The simplest of all tests that we will deal with in this class is distinguishing between means. Asking, are two means different or are they the same? So, let's say we have M&M cells at Hy-Vee and Price Chopper. So what we do is we go to Price Chopper, we sample 30 Price Choppers, we go to Hy-Vee, we sample 30 Hy-Vees. I'm a sales analyst for Mars Company, and I look at the sales numbers per week at Price Chopper and Hy-Vee, and I want to know, do Price Chopper and Hy-Vee as chains sell similar levels of M&Ms, or do they sell different levels of M&Ms on a weekly basis? So what I would do is I would get the sample mean from Price Chopper and the sample mean from Hy-Vee, and I would want to know, are these two means different? Well, the numbers are going to be different because it's just the nature of numbers. It's very difficult to arrive at exactly the same average from two independent samples. So they're going to be different, but the question is not are they different numerically, but are they different enough that we can say that Price Chopper sells more or less than Hy-Vee does. That's where statistical inference comes in. So how do we do that? Well, we get the sample mean, but then we place a confidence interval around those estimates. So we have the mean, but the mean has variation associated with it because every Price Chopper is different. Price Choppers exist in different markets, in different neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. One Price Chopper might sell a lot of M&Ms, another Price Chopper sells very few M&Ms. So that average has some variation around it, and that variation is important because presumably that variation reflects the variation that is in the population if you sampled all Price Choppers rather than just the 30 Price Choppers that you looked at. The more variation there is from one Price Chopper to another, the harder it is to nail down what the true mean is, the true average is, because there's more variability. If all Price Choppers were exactly the same, it's very easy to nail down what the true average sales are. So that variability goes into affecting how much variation there is around the mean. That affects how big the confidence interval is. So when we calculate this confidence interval, we want to calculate it and have a way of knowing how much confidence we can put in that estimate. And so what we use in the calculation of all of this is we use something called the alpha level. The alpha level is the type 1 error rate. Have any of you guys heard this before? What is the type 1 error rate? In plain terms, plain English terms. If we're testing to see if the Price Chopper average is different from the Hy-Vee average, how would you interpret the alpha level for somebody, for your grandmother, for example? If you're trying to explain alpha level to your grandmother. Yeah.
Isn't it the odds that you're
Yes. So the type 1 error rate is the probability of concluding that, in this case, because we're talking about means, two means are different. When they are not. So it's called a type 1 error rate because it is an error. Because you're sampling, you don't actually know what the true population mean is. If you could pick up the hotline to God and say, how many M&Ms are sold by Price Chopper nationwide? God would tell you the answer. Then you would say to him, because you still have him on the line, how many M&Ms are sold per week at Hy-Vee? He would give you that number, and because he knows everything, if those two numbers are different, regardless of how close together they might be, then those two numbers are different, because God knows the population. You, a statistician, a sales analyst, do not know the population. You get a sample of the population, which is an estimate of the population mean. You get a sample from the other chain, which is an estimate of the population mean. Those numbers are going to be different. Your question is, how different do they have to be in order for me to conclude that they are actually different? So what you do is you set at the beginning, how often do you want to make that mistake? How often are you comfortable making the mistake of saying that two chains are different in their M&M cells when they actually are not? Because you may sample price chopper and you may sample Hy-V, get their cells numbers, get the averages, run a statistical test on them, conclude that they are different, and then you pick up the phone to God and he's like, yeah, you messed up. They're not different. Because I know the fact that they're exactly the same because I'm God. So that's what the type 1 error rate is. Concluding that two things are different when in actuality they're not. Alpha is just the rate at which we want to do that. And oftentimes we set it at 5% because quite frankly being 5% wrong is not that big a deal generally. If you score a 95% on a test, reasonably happy with that outcome? Yeah, sure, you should be. Because you were mostly right. Overwhelmingly right. That number is not set in stone, though. You, the researcher, can decide what you want that thing to be. Who really cares about the sales numbers for M&Ms? Mars Company, certainly. Do any of the rest of us really care? No, I don't care. What kind of M&Ms do you like the most? Peanut butter? Oh, I love caramel M&Ms. They are my favorite. I have a bag of them in my car, actually, at this moment, unopened. Not the family size, but not the little take to the movie theater and sneak into the movie theater size, but the one in between. I care about M&Ms, but I don't care about the sales of M&Ms. So for me, concluding that sales are different in two chains, 5% is a perfectly appropriate type 1 error rate. Let's think of a different scenario. I'm a doctor. I'm a researcher. Children's Mercy. I work on cancer, work on a particular type of cancer called glioblastoma. You guys know what glioblastoma is? Glioblastoma, it's a brain cancer. Did you guys go to the, well, you didn't go to the Duke Colloquium last year because it was virtual. Have you been to the Duke Colloquium in the time that you've been here? You have. The Duke Colloquium, do you know who it's named after? It's named after a former faculty member here. He was here for my first 2 years when I started here. Back in 2000, David Duke, he was in the religion department, or philosophy department, I think. When I got here, he had already been diagnosed with glioblastoma. It's a brain cancer, and basically you don't survive it. Not only do you not survive it, you die fairly quickly from it. I think the normal life expectancy after you're diagnosed with glioblastoma is about 6 months. So it would be really good if you could come up with a cure for glioblastoma. It's not a super common cancer, but it's common enough, and it would be really nice to have a cure to it, because right now there's not one. If you're diagnosed with glioblastoma, you can prolong your life to maybe a year and a half, but you're not going to live a decade. So you're a researcher at Children's Mercy, and you think you have come up with a drug that cures people of glioblastoma. It's chemotherapeutic. This is a totally made-up example, by the way. I don't even know if they work on cancer at Children's Mercy. It's a chemotherapeutic agent that nobody has ever used before. And one of the reasons that it works so well is it can cross the blood-brain barrier, and when it gets in there, it is toxic as hell. It takes out the cancer, it kills it. But it also is pretty rough on your body because it is a very toxic chemotherapeutic agent. It kills the glioblastoma, but You also now need a liver transplant because it has also destroyed your liver. Liver transplants are way easier to come by than getting over untreated glioblastoma. So patients might be willing to get rid of glioblastoma if it costs them a liver. Find a donor, get a liver transplant after you get all the chemotherapeutics out of your blood system, and then you can go on and live your life. Now, you would be required by the FDA to run an experiment where you had a control group that did not get the treatment and an experimental group that did get the treatment, and they would look at whether or not there were better outcomes for those who got the chemotherapeutic versus those who got a placebo. Now, knowing that the cost of the chemotherapeutic is that it probably fries your liver, how often do you want to say that the experimental group fares better than the control group when in actuality they don't? Do you want to make that mistake 5 times out of 100? What do you probably want to do? You probably don't want to make that mistake. So for this kind of a study, an alpha level of 0.05 would probably be totally inappropriate because you don't want to make a type 1 error 5% of the time. You might want to instead only make that type 1 error 1% of the time, saying that it works when it doesn't. You may actually only want to make that error 0.1% of the time. If alpha is normally 0.05 for 5% of the time, it's 0.01. For 1% of the time, it's 0.001 for 0.1% of the time. You, the researcher, you, the sales analyst, whatever you're doing, you set up front how often you're comfortable making this mistake. And if you read the literature, you will see some studies where alpha level is 0.05. In other places, you'll see it where it's 0.1, where they'll accept a type 1 error 10% of the time. That's less common than making the type 1 error rate more stringent, going down to 0.1 or 0.01 or 0.01. When you lower this to 0.01 or 0.001, it means that when you find a difference, you are more confident that that difference is real. Because your chances of observing a difference and it not being real are really, really low, 0.1% of the time. So you, the researcher, have some flexibility here. You generally have to explain to yourself why you're deviating from an alpha level of 0.05. But generally, you only deviate from it when you have a pretty darn good reason for doing that. But that's the basis of what alpha is. If we decide that we only want to make a type 1 error 1% of the time, we have to expand our confidence interval out to 3 standard deviations, because remember, 3 standard deviations includes 99% of that distribution of sample means. So the type 1 error rate is directly related back to the empirical rule, because the lower your type 1 error rate, the more of this normal distribution you're including in that distribution of sample means. Questions? This is a good break point. Things that I want you to do for Monday. This is a type 1 error. I want you to go to your textbook and find what a type 2 error is. We will begin there on Monday. There is also an R Markdown file in today's folder. Open that up, start working through it. It relies on the Spanish flu data set from Switzerland, looking at the age at which people died from Spanish flu. And it takes you through an exercise that illustrates for you that the central limit theorem actually does work. It's going to require you to load a couple of functions at the beginning of the script. A function is just a big long stretch of code that does something in the background whenever you call it up. For this, it's a function that creates these shaded diagrams. There's also another function that does a simulation. Just load those functions. You don't really have to worry about the intricacies of what's going on under them. Also, we went through two ways of generating data in R. One way is to generate it from scratch by building vectors, combining those vectors into a data frame. Another way is getting a data frame and importing it from a CSV file. There's another way that you can get data. You can actually gather data by downloading it directly from the web. In this script, there is a line of code that basically goes and gets a data set from a website and it imports it in. That's the Spanish flu website, so just follow that as well. Start working through that over the weekend. It's one of the few times where I'm actually going to give you a functional script, and the reason that I'm giving you the functional script is because of the big functions that are in there. To have you reproduce those by typing them in would be a total pain in the butt. But as you're working through the R script, don't just click Command Enter, Command Enter, Command Enter, or Control Enter, Control Enter, Control Enter. Start paying attention to what's in those lines of code as you have a little bit of knowledge about what R is about. Use this exercise to gain some insight into other things that R can do. R is going to start making some graphics. Also, you'll see at the top of the script, it loads packages using a program called Pacman. So you're probably going to have to install Pacman at the beginning of the R script. Pacman is just a little package that allows you to load multiple other packages all at once. So over time, as your scripts get more and more complicated, they're going to require more and more packages being loaded. So you can do library package, library package, library package, library package, library package, or you can just do Pacman, library, 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 or Pacman, package, 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 and do it all in one fell swoop. So it adds some new functionality for you. But the main thing is it is going to look at a distribution that looks like this. This is the actual distribution of the age of death for Spanish flu in Switzerland. This is definitely not a normal distribution, but if you go to this distribution, sample individuals from it and say, at what age did you die? Store those sample means and create a distribution of sample means. You should see the distribution of sample means to look normal if the central limit theorem actually holds true. And so what this script does is it varies the sample size that you pull from this original distribution, and it looks at the effective sample size on how quickly you reach what looks like a normal curve, a normal distribution of sample means. So start working through that. We're going to continue talking about this on Monday. Any questions? Yes, ma'am. No, we're going to be talking about this on Monday, so if you can get it done over the weekend, there's going to be a homework assignment that I'm going to give you that is actually graded, where I actually have you do some hand calculations and things like this. That will have a due date for it. This is one of those homeworks that is really intended to just get you thinking about the ideas. I'm not going to take it up or anything else. If I was going to do it for a grade, I probably wouldn't have written the script for it. Or help the person actually who wrote the script. This is another one of those collaborations with KU. There will be a graded assignment on the central limit theorem and confidence intervals and things like that, but that's going to be next week, not now. This is just for you to start thinking about the central limit theorem, convincing yourself that it actually works, and what it means for doing statistics. So yeah, do it when you can get it done. If you can get it done before Monday, that will help you when we're back here on Monday. But if you don't, it's not the end of the world. All right, questions? All right, I'll see you guys on Monday then.